And welcome back again, wrestling fans. It's episode 146 of the RUDIS Wrestling Podcast, along with Matt Dernlan. I'm Jason Bryant. And Matt, even if we wouldn't have had this global pandemic and we would have had 40,000 people come to the glorious state of Minnesota and come to the wonderful Twin Cities and sit in this gigantic football stadium, I told you it wasn't going to snow. We were not going to have a snowstorm at the NCAA Championships. And by golly, that weekend came and went, even though none of us were there, except for those of us that live here. We did not have a snowstorm during the NCAA Championships. We, however, did have a snowstorm on Easter Sunday. So, jokes on me, but I would gladly take snow in April rather than have snow in March. And of course, I think we all would have loved to have had March. But as we get further and further away from it, Matt, we're still in a weird world of sports where we're talking about lists and Rushmore season and listicles and things. And we are actually finishing up on what I think has been a successful sauntering into this general topic with the 75th anniversary team that was released back in 2005. Today, we focus on the heavyweights, which was 177 pounds and up. And so far, we've gotten some great feedback. And I do want to touch on some of the feedback that we did get before we get in today. And one of it was from our YouTube comments. I think it was Robert Bixby pointed out we did not mention Lowell Lang. And the reason we didn't mention Lowell Lang is he wasn't on the ballot. Now, Gray Simons also was not on the ballot. And I made a point to bring him up heavily in the first episode of this three-part series. But that brings up a couple names we're going to bring up here on this show that weren't on the ballot. But we also want to hear some feedback on, who could have at least been on the ballot, because I think the initial lists were pretty good, Matt. I mean, we're arguing really fine nuances here, and it's going to be a real fine nuance here when we get to the upper weights. But so far, the first two episodes of this series, we've had some really good discussion, and some great names have not been talked about, and some great names have been left out, and some cool things like, Tim Krieger's number 1 seed 4 times. I mean, that got brought up almost as an afterthought.
Yeah, I think the fun part of this series or these conversations that we've had is finding what I don't know. And I like you, I pride myself in knowing the history of wrestling. It's always been a very, very important thing to me, something that I could pass on to my wrestlers and apply to my own life. But I think the outcome of this is everything I didn't know. And there was so much that I didn't know and so much that I've been exposed to that it's been really fun figuring out all those things and all those pieces and all those people that I wasn't even aware of, that I'd maybe heard a name at some point, but really didn't know what they did and how much they actually contributed to the sport of wrestling. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and again, going back through and finding some names and trying to look up things to, I don't know, it's kind of hard to say you're trying to find ways to disqualify people, but that's kind of what we've been doing, and looking at, obviously some wrestlers like our 4-timers have set the bar in terms of their collegiate success. And again, to preface this is not international career. And in our topics today, it's not professional wrestling careers that are going to make an issue here. This is strictly your college career, what you did on the college mats, not what you did while you were in college, say internationally, like we had John Smith. And Matt, he called me this morning and I was like, oh no, he's watched the show. He's coming out.
John W on the line.
And that's one of those things. And when it's one of those phone calls when you get, and he doesn't call me very often. It's one of those things. I'm sitting there eating breakfast, and pardon the name drop here, folks, but it's just one of those things where you look at your phone and it's like you look at it, you're like, and you think about it for a brief second. And then you do one of these, you show your spouse. When your spouse knows who the person is calling you, and there's a lot of wrestling people that I'll get calls from, but I'll hold that one up and she just kind of gives me this nod like, yeah, go ahead. You can get that one. Or,
okay, so in what instance would you not pick up for John Smith? What would have to be the scenario that you wouldn't pick his phone up?
It depends on how involved I was with business in the other office that we have in our homes. I'll just say that if it was after a rough meal of chili, I may not be answering that while I'm, taking care of number 2. That's maybe the one place there's some other places you can use your imagination, but yeah. In a regular choice of a workday, usually that's a call I'm going to answer. One time Terry Brands called me at the Midlands, and I'm out having wings at B-dubs or something. Might have been watching a UFC fight and pops up my phone. And it wasn't me that noticed it. I think it might have been Allie Reagan, who was actually sitting next to me. She elbows me. She goes, JB, you might want to get that. And I looked like, yeah, I might want to get that. But yeah, so I guess, the best time for me not to answer the phones when I'm indisposed.
There you go.
That's basically the answer to really the only question. And come on, people, we know we've answered those calls too. But there's a mute button on your phone for a reason. But you'll never know. Now,
are you ready to jump into this? And
yeah, because John Smith wasn't ready to kill me over this. So at least I don't think he had seen it, because I surely as heck wasn't going to bring it up. So the 75th anniversary team, again, top 5 wrestlers per light, middle, and heavy was how this was decided in terms on a fan vote. Again, 2005, this was put out. So the team was Cael Sanderson. Actually, I've already lost the team. Okay, here we go. I had the team on a different page. So we had Kurt Angle, Ed Banach, Carlton Haselrig, Dan Hodge, and Cael Sanderson was the team. Also in the group on the ballot that was being argued here, Chris Campbell of Iowa, Dick DiBatista of Penn, Dick Hutton of then Oklahoma A&M, now Oklahoma State, Jess Lewis from Oregon State, Mark Lieberman from Lehigh, Earl McCready from Oklahoma A&M, now Oklahoma State, Stephen Neal from Cal State Bakersfield, now known as CSU Bakersfield. I want to get that right. Ben Peterson of Iowa State, Mark Schultz of UCLA in Oklahoma. A lot of people don't remember or even know he actually attended UCLA. Greg Strobel from Oregon State, and Chris Taylor from Iowa State, who actually had 2 years in junior college. We'll actually get to that later on. Also of note that we are going to discuss, not on the ballot, not even listed, Greg Jones of West Virginia. Of course, most people can probably figure out why there. And Jimmy Jackson of Oklahoma State. Again, we are talking 177 and up here. And while we talk about that, I think the first two are pretty much slam dunks that we know. One, 159-0, 4-time undefeated national champion. That's Mr. Cael Sanderson. And number 2, an award is named after him, 46-0, 3-time national champion from Oklahoma, Dan Hodge. Hodge, probably because the award's named after him, and I think Mike Chapman and Win Magazine get the assist on, supplanting him as 1-2 with Cael on the team. But obviously, Cael sets the bar for college wrestling. There is no other performance that is higher than 4 years undefeated and 4 national championships. That's the bar, folks. That's the bar.
And that conversation begins and ends here, right? I mean, on how many shows when we're discussing the greatest ever would we spend 30 seconds talking about Cael? Because it's an open and shut case. When it comes to this, it's open and shut. Yes, he was the greatest ever. He's 4-time undefeated champ. There's
always everybody that's going to throw the Paul Jen thing out when he was a redshirt freshman at Iowa State. But again, under the rules, those don't count. Guess what? Gable had matches when he was a true freshman that weren't counted in that system. So you can look at him a couple different ways. But yeah, this one's pretty much open and shut in terms of, Cael is the bar when it comes to college wrestling greatness. I've got 2 Wheaties boxes behind me that I've had for almost 20 years at this point, and I don't get Wheaties boxes to just anybody. Sorry, Walter Payton, you were great, but Cael Sanderson, he's number 1 on our list. Yeah,
I mean, it's he did something that no one else did. I mean, that's all you have to say. And yeah, I mean, we could go on with all the superlatives, but everybody's taken all those. Everybody's written all those. Everybody's talked about those. So, there's plenty of other things to get into. There's so many. I mean, this is the hardest division, the upper weights, right? I mean, when we really start digging in and going through the careers, and I mean, this is, I think, hands down, outside of the top 2, those are relatively easy. And I know revisiting Dan Hodge in relation to the previous 2 shows, I think off camera in different conversations, the thing with Dan Hodge is his sample size is a little bit greater than those other 3-timers that weren't able to compete as freshmen. We saw a lot of those 3-timers having matches or careers in the 20s and 30s. Dan Hodge is right up around 50. And of those 50, 46 wins to be exact, correct?
Yeah, 46-0.
46-0, 36 were pins. So
36 were of the pin variety, yes.
Which is just speaks to his dominance. When there's a greater sample size. And when you dig into the sample size, his dominance within his competition is, up there with the greats of all time. And I think, so the top two are easy. Sanderson and Hodge, two names that are so synonymous with the sport of wrestling. 1 and 2, very easy, at least in my mind. I don't know how you feel there. Yeah.
Right. And I'm pretty much, the only thing I think that might be questioning is, again, the era, although Dan Hodge was post-World War II era, which was very interesting because I'm going through some of these old amateur wrestling newses, and I'm starting in 56. And I'm really kind of looking back at the history, and I'm thinking about how people would consume this information. And at the time, of course, Oklahoma City is where amateur wrestling news was based for over 60 years. And so the access to Oklahoma, then Oklahoma A&M, and then Oklahoma was very good. And those teams were very powerful at the time. And it's just weird to go through to read, like, Dan Hodge, a junior undefeated, just you're reading it like he's just another junior out there. That's won a title, going for his second title. It's really kind of cool to go through and look at that. And it's almost as much access as we have to wrestlers today. I almost feel like some of those old fans that got amateur wrestling news back in the 50s, when it was wrestling news and reports for the first couple years, you'd open it up and you actually got to experience Dan Hodge for the first, through reading. And we didn't get that. We get to experience these kids that are just lights out. You talk about the interviews that we've got coming here on RUDIS with Logan Stieber. Everybody knew who Logan Stieber was freshman year in high school, and we've got video of it. We can pretty much document almost every single one of his major matches in his career. But when you're opening the pages and seeing Dan Hodge, there is at least some media, I guess, paper trail of Dan Hodge's career. So that kind of puts him in that lore where it's not like we don't have to search very hard to. We do have to search hard, but we don't have that. Well, what was it like back then? We actually have that history, at least starting his junior year, documented in amateur wrestling news, which was pretty unique at the time. Now, there is some discussion about should the trophy be named after Hodge. Well, that's a Mike Chapman thing. He's the one that invented it with Win Magazine. Take that up with him. When we look at who's on the ballot, who's not on the ballot, let's just break this down. 3-time champions. This is the field we are discussing. We've got 2. We need to pick 3 out of the remaining field. 3-time champions: Dick Hutton, Ed Banach, Carlton Haselrig, Earl McCready, Mark Schultz. Not on the ballot: Jimmy Jackson and Greg Jones. 2-time champions: Kurt Angle, Stephen Neal, Chris Campbell, Dick DiBatista, Jess Lewis, Mark Lieberman, Ben Peterson, Greg Strobel, Chris Taylor. So what's amazing there, other than coughing, the depth that we have to pick from here. So where do we start? I think we start with the 3-time champions, because logically you'd almost have to include. It's hard for me to look at a 2-time champ on this list with maybe one exception and try to disqualify him. Although we've got a situation where Earl McCready was an era of 25 matches and things of that nature. So go ahead, Matt.
This is actually a sidebar that I was thinking about that we really haven't talked about in the previous 2 episodes. And this is a question for you as a historian, a journalist, and as an announcer. We think about the visibility that our athletes enjoy in today's modern age. They're on Flow. They're everywhere. We have access to interviews. We can track them through high school. We can see them in high school from a young age. We see them and we see their development and their growth and their accomplishments. Do you think there's a value in the mystery of these older guys? Or how do you think that they would be viewed in today's day and age, like a Dan Hodge? If we saw his career on display, we saw his physical dominance on display. And then in addition to that, this is kind of a fun sidebar. The feats of strength that we enjoy with Danny Hodge. I think we see the exploits now of Ben Askren busting up a watermelon, but we've seen Danny Hodge and the stories of him physically pulverizing an apple in the palm of his hands. If we would have had a figure like that in today's modern age, would his persona be greater because of the access we have to him? Or is it greater because there's a legend that grew beyond what we could see or hear?
I think some of Dan Hodge's greatness that kind of transcends it a little bit comes from his career outside of wrestling, where he was a boxer and a professional wrestler in an era where the professional wrestling wasn't as through that hokey era. And then we got to get into what we have now, and what's that nobody even fights the term sports entertainment anymore. That nobody likes to use the term fake in that regard, at least from that side of the industry. But, he is a guy that was revered. Jim Ross, the longtime broadcaster for the WWE, now he's with AEW, All Elite Wrestling. He raves about Dan Hodge, and this is a guy who's been in the professional wrestling business for over 40 years, and he still to this day talks about Dan Hodge. So Hodge gets a little bit of that crossover appeal that we really don't get. We do get that from Kurt Angle in a new era with his Olympic gold, and then going into the WWF, then as it was changed to the WWE and his professional sports entertainment outfits. But because Hodge he's now 87 years old, he did have the situation a year or two ago. I think he did drive off, and there was a little alert for him. They did find him, but even as recently as 3 years ago, he was at the Hall of Fame crushing apples. So in your mid 80s, you're still able to do this feat of strength. It's quite amazing. So there's that lore. The access question, though. Back in the day, the access for him of those pro wrestling magazines and those things, and because he was in different worlds. Once he was out of college wrestling, his career wasn't over. He was in the spotlight. So that's the thing that made him a bit of a transcendent character, even without the 24-hour media access that we have today. So, and knowing the personality that he's got, I think he'd have been just fine. He would have been probably maybe to compare him to Mike Trout, who's a really kind of a low key, doesn't do a whole lot of interviews, kind of not a boisterous personality, just a low key guy, goes out there, gets the job done, is the best at what he does, and doesn't really make a big thing of it. So maybe Trout might be the best, almost boring to some degree. People want more out of him, and maybe that's what we're maybe sometimes used to with wrestling. But in Hodge's case, he was kind of hard to put a guy that was an old school gentleman into today's world. So I think that's probably the biggest thing with how Hodge would adapt to today's media. If a character like him is if we had him today.
And that's another interesting dynamic, specifically when it comes to this list, because there's a number, in addition to Dan Hodge, there's a number of names and individuals on this list that crossed over and have transcended the sport in different ways. And it'll be interesting to unpack not only their accomplishments in the sport of wrestling, but how did their effect outside of amateur wrestling and their exposure into NFL or WWE, in UFC, MMA, how that affected people's perception in regards to this list?
Yeah, it's hard to say. As far as where we start, I don't know. Where do you think we start? I think I've got the stats broken down alphabetically, so I think that's kind of how we probably should do it. And right off the top.
And I think that's been the one rhyme or reason where we've kind of come up with a scenario that we do prioritize titles, as a differentiating point. Like if we had to come up with our criteria, I know for me, my criteria is established by number of titles. Is kind of, if all else is equal, I'm probably going to pick titles over, body of work.
Right. And as we start the dynamic, we've already checked Sanderson and Hodge off the box, and we start alphabetically with Angle. And at the time this is coming out, 2005, I was actually interviewing Kurt when he was doing an autograph session, and he was telling me, he said, it's great when people come up to me and says, "Oh yeah, I remember your finals match with Turkey, in insert year here, whatever year it was. I thought I had it on the sheet. And rather than I come up and say, "Oh yeah, I remember your match with The Rock." Well, that's cool. But I think part of Angle getting on this team was because of his Olympic credentials, and because he was in the WWE or WWF as it was known at the time. I'm not really sure when they went from F to E, but World Wildlife Foundation certainly does. But 116, 10, and 2, did not place as a true freshman, won it as a sophomore, second as a junior, won it as a senior. So he lost to, I cannot say this guy's name right. I want to say it's Kopachi Tyler from Eastern Illinois. It's one of those names I've been trying to find out how to say it, because he ends up wrestling him later in his career at the NCAAs and beats him. So you've got a DNP in an era where you still, you're 0-1, follow the leader, because Tyler got beat his next round, comes back, goes undefeated, beats Greg Halliday in the finals, comes back as a returning champ, loses to John Llewellyn of Illinois, and then beats Sylvester Turkey of NC State in the finals. So we've got 10 losses, we've got 2 titles and a DNP, but we have the guy who won the 96 Olympic championship with a broken freaking neck. It's true. It's true. One of my favorite professional wrestlers of all time, but I don't know if Kurt's collegiate credentials can keep him on this list here.
I honestly, you can't, because you go down to, well, it's not on the list, but the next guy of that era, and that would be Stephen Neal, and we haven't really dug into him, but based on his career, just statistically, without breaking it down in depth, he's got more podium placements, 4-time, less losses, 9 as opposed to 10. I do think, like it or not, since this was a fan poll, it was influenced by what he was doing. This was in the heart of Kurt Angle's WWE run, right? In 2005. And I don't follow the WWE. I'm aware of it and I see what's going on. I couldn't tell you the title list today, but I believe that was kind of it, Kurt Angle's major run in the WWE, right in that 2000 to 2008-9. I can't speak to that specifically, but
I'm not going to try to speak pro wrestling a whole lot. My era of pro wrestling's in the 80s and 90s. So.
But when this 75th anniversary team came out in 2005, semantics aside about where his pro career was at the time, he was a very visible entertainment figure in the sports world at that time.
Yeah, he's one of the guys that brought me back into watching it, because I watched him win in 96. I mean, he was one of those guys that when I was getting into wrestling was on top of the international world. So it was great to follow him in. And I was like, then I remember when he was making his run there, and I was like, wait a minute. Oh, they're making him a heel? No, I wouldn't do, but again, it's one of those things that almost happened organically, kind of like, people booing The Rock when he came through. But from a credential standpoint, it's kind of weird that we're looking at one of my, it's one of my favorite wrestlers. He's one of my favorite professional wrestlers, but but also he's got 8 losses and a tie as a freshman, and only lost 2 matches the rest of the way. And that seems to be, again, that common theme. Most of the freshman champions that have these great careers, most of their losses are happening as a freshman. But maybe, the DNP, again, Stephen Neal had a situation where he could wrestle back after a loss, depending on when that loss happened. Well, Angle was still at the tail end of that follow the leader type. So he didn't have a chance to come back and say lose in the first round or second round and come back and take third. So it's kind of a victim of circumstance. He probably could have come back in place, but we'll never know. But he still has a DNP, a 1, 2, and a 1 next to his name.
And I think the fascinating thing about Kurt Angle, when we look at him, he was the everyman's champion, in the sense like he was David versus Goliath. Like he was he's a 220 pound ish type heavyweight wrestling Sylvester Turkey, who was another professional monster, right? Yeah. And so I think when we think about the heavyweight weight class, we usually gravitate to the monsters or the small guys. And I mean, look at Gwiz, look at Kyle Snyder, and I know what they've done post collegiately, but I think that was some of the similar narratives that really captured our attention, that these are smaller heavyweights, smaller athletic heavyweights, figuring a way around these bigger, equally athletic heavyweights. Because I remember Sylvester Turkey wasn't just this big plodding, behemoth of a man. He was more in the body type of a Adam Kuhn, who was huge,
just
but
a
also
chiseled giant,
but could move and was somewhat athletic. And that's what was fascinating about. I remember seeing that duck that Kurt Angle hit on Sylvester Turkey, and I'm like, that's how you skin a cat. Like how you creatively match up against a guy who looked like 100 pounds bigger than you, and how do you actually beat it? And that's so fascinating. And it's the underdog story, even though he was credential wise one of the greatest ever. Like it's still fascinating. And regardless of what his accomplishments were, when you step out on a mat with a guy that's 6 inches taller, 100 pounds bigger, you always assume that guy's the underdog.
Yeah, usually you come to a fight with you come to a wrestling match with Sylvester Turkey, you need a bat normally. Next one, Ed Banach. He's listed 141 wins, 9 losses, 1 tie, with 1-1-2-1 in 1982. Lost arguably one of the most talked about NCAA finals. And what's funny, they say people call that one of the greatest finals of all time in terms of name recognition, credentials. They would both go on to be Olympic champions. But I'm sitting there wondering, from a tactical and technical standpoint, there is definitely some sloppy moments in this match that it's definitely one of the most entertaining matches I've ever seen of the NCAA finals, looking at it on tape. But and I'm the last guy you're going to take technical advice from, Matt, but am I wrong in that assumption, knowing this was his match with Schultz there were definitely some sloppy moments. They were exciting, but it's just like, is that the greatest finals match of all time?
No, I mean, when you look at it,
you just said no. You didn't even. You're like, well, no. You went no.
No. I mean, I think at the time it was the most hyped. It was the most hyped match because I remember we got to see it on TV and people were talking about
3,
this.
by the way, so I didn't.
Yeah, and so I think that it was the first time that the public was aware of the hype, was aware of the credentials, was aware of the stage and the magnitude of this match, the potential matchup between Banach and Schultz. Because it pales in comparison to the exposure and the buildup of matches we have now. But at the time, in the early 1980s, there wasn't a more hyped match throughout the season. I remember people talking about this and then it actually happening. And it was an entertaining match. It wasn't the best match. It was a highly entertaining match, but it wasn't
entertaining to this day.
Yeah.
Especially if I think since Mark Schultz has kind of made his presence felt again in wrestling, post his book, post the Foxcatcher movies, and, in his persona that exists on social media, which borders on entertaining and train wreck all at the same time. That is also entertaining, may not be the most refined, but the fact that Banach's lore amongst Iowa is also very highly regarded. It's one of those things where you look at Banach's career and he would be one of those guys that are fighting to be on that Iowa Mount Rushmore. But when you got that match and look at his career, never had an undefeated season either. 41-3 as a freshman, 35-1 as a sophomore, 31-2-1 as a junior, losing to Schultz 16-8 in the finals. He had pinned Charlie Heller in the semis, who he had beaten the year before from Clarion in the finals. And then I'm going, then we look at his next, beating Bill Scher and Mike Mann. So Bill Scher's another solid win there from the University of Nebraska, but, never had an undefeated season, which is interesting for a 3-time, almost 4-time champ, 4-time finalist.
Yeah, really interesting there. And one other note, I think what makes the match with Schultz so appealing is it broke the vein of typical finals matches where we see, typically in the quarters, we see really highly entertaining matches. And then in the finals, you see guys really lock it down, wrestle really conservatively. And that's been a narrative that's been consistent throughout the history of the NCAA finals. This is one of the first matches where they just broke it loose and they both wrestled with reckless abandon, which was not consistent with the finals matches that we typically see, which I think builds up the magnitude of this match historically, even in today's day and age. But yeah, it is interesting that Banach never had an undefeated season. We're talking about one of the all-time greats that I would definitely, I think, based upon everything he did, it would be hard for you to convince me to kick him off of the list. I would have to have a really compelling case to remove him from the list, but it is surprising that he was never undefeated.
Yeah, that's going to be, we got so many, and the thing is, we may go even a little overtime here just thinking about this because it's just, there's so much to unpack with this weight class. Next one, moving on, he's on the team, Carlton Haselrig, 143-3-1, started his career playing football at Lock Haven, transferred back to Pitt-Johnstown, where he finished 3rd in Division II as a freshman. What was interesting, he had a loss earlier in the year, but the 3rd, if you look at it as Division II year, now he did not qualify for the national championships that year at Division I, back in the era where, based on the number of qualifiers and how Division II had placed, that's how many bids it got. It was like the old historical data. So he goes DNQ 1-1-1 Division I, 3-1-1-1 Division II. Here's the caveat to this. As a freshman, he was 24-2. So 2 of his 3 losses came his freshman year. He lost in the semifinals to Dean Hall of Edinburgh, who was 6th that year in Division I. That was it. That was his loss. He lost in the semis, takes 3rd. That was his one loss. It's not like he was, it was okay. So what happens with Dean Hall? Dean Hall places at D1. Then Haselrig beats Dean Hall in the finals the next year at Division I. So you basically lost a 2-point match to get to the D2 finals. That's all that kept him from wrestling in the Division I championships on 4 occasions. With if he's on the other side of the bracket, there's a guy from Liberty named Hatch that was in the finals against Dean Hall. So if he's bracketed on the other side, what's he do his freshman year? But again, one of those things where the victim of circumstance, he doesn't get that opportunity to be on the other side of the bracket. He loses to a guy that was ultimately 6th in Division I. So I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that a 6, 7, 8 placement would have been logical, maybe to assume, considering his close loss to Dean Hall, who, again, that was also an era where Edinburgh was making that move from Division II to Division I full-time. And it's strange to go back and look at that bracket and be like, oh, so it was literally 2 points that kept him away from being in the tournament 4 times.
Yeah, for me and Carlton Haselrig, it really comes down to total titles and him validating his opportunities. People may say, oh, they were D2. No, you validated all of them by running 3 straight D1 titles for a total of 6. So, if my logic applies in this situation, he's a guy that's on the team, because how do you get 6 when most people only have 4 to get? So, I mean, what he did with his opportunities, you can argue what those opportunities were, but he did in fact win 6 titles overall. And I think, again, it's hard not to have his story influence the perception of your decision, right? And I can see how this was difficult. And looking back, like, especially when the polls, the fans drove the poll, how do you remove his story out of the narrative? You can't remove it and say, well, okay, all I know is this guy was a D2 guy that won 3, and then. But if you look at his high school career, I believe he was his high school wrestling team.
Yes,
correct?
He was.
Right. So, I mean, it's hard to remove that chapter out of the story when factoring into the overall decision of who would you vote for to make the team. So, yeah, for me, it's pretty simple. Total titles and the way he won his titles, for me, puts him on the team. So now it makes the discussion even harder, JB, because now I pretty much agreed with 4 out of the 5 guys on the list and saying I have a hard time removing them when we have about 22 other people to get to.
And we have a DNQ and a guy who didn't win Division II. It's like I said, we're kind of working off it. That's where this gets all cattywampus here. So now we go to the rest of the list. Some things I'm looking at. Chris Campbell, 121, 5, and 4. With his career losses, 3 his freshman year, 2 his sophomore year, does not place second, first. So looking at, in researching this is where the fun stuff came up. And I actually called you about this one. So as a freshman, he was the number 3 seed and lost to a guy from Rutgers named Steve Bonzel in the first round. Bonzel did not place. Bonzel lost to Bill Hill of East Carolina, who eventually that year became that school's only Division I All-American. Bonzel's kid, Steve, Division III All-American a couple years ago for Leo Coker at the University of Chicago. So it's one of those things. The rabbit hole of wrestling as it is. Okay, Steve Bonzel, Rutgers. I wonder if he's any relation to the Steve Bonzel at Chicago. I go to the website. Boom, that's Steve Bonzel's from New Jersey. I'm like, well, that's Rutgers is. That's where Rutgers is. Let's email Leo. Yep, that's his dad. So all the weird connections we've got, and of course, there's that's a family name that people kind of know as well, Matt.
Yeah, and I think and Matt Storniolo is probably going to text me after this, because I believe his coach there's a legendary coach in the Philadelphia area. I believe it's Craig Bonsall.
It could be Dave or Dale. One of those things jumping to mind.
Maybe it's
I'm going to Google this.
Yeah. And I know he's a legendary coach. I mean, he's a guy that Matt Storniolo credits a lot of his success to. And there's a laundry list. So I'm blanking on the first name of his
South
coach.
Dale. Yeah, of course. I'm blanking on that too. Again, people at East are going to be like, what are you? It's like, what'd you call it? Why'd you call it Taylor Ham? So anyway, Yeah, there's definitely the Bonzel name has been known, so that's one that was one of those connections. But as we circle it back to Chris Campbell, while we both eat our shoes here, again, Hill was the only All-American at East Carolina's D1 history. So then, as a sophomore, he lost to Mike Lieberman of Lehigh in the finals, beating Willie Gadsden in the semis, beats Mark Johnson in back-to-back years to win his 2 titles. And if you've ever seen pictures of Mark Johnson in that era, good night. Lou Ferrigno will be like, that dude's jacked. And if you don't know who Lou Ferrigno is, kids, Google it.
So, yeah, I mean, and I remember Chris Campbell being the same. I mean, this guy was granite, especially and most people remember his comeback when he was 38, made the Olympic team, earned a bronze medal. And even then at 38, this guy was built like a Greek god. And both those guys, Mark Johnson and Chris Campbell, just physical specimens. And, in the day and age where we don't really look back and think about, like, right now we see athletes and they have access to, crazy training techniques, crazy nutritional plans. These guys,
they ate a lot of raw eggs.
They wrote, yes.
They ate a lot of raw eggs. Now, moving on, this one is one I want to know more about because Dick DiBatista just recently passed away. We're talking within the past month. He wrestled for Penn, was undefeated, 37-0, freshman, obviously ineligible, champion, and then World War II broke out. So he never had the opportunity to win a 3rd title. Career was stopped by World War II, and I'm sitting there, and it's like, well, you've got an undefeated guy that was a champion, then war broke out. He's part of that first generation of asterisks. With we're going through one here, and this guy definitely fits the bill there. Beats Al Crawford of Appalachian State with 16 in the weight class, and the reason I mention that is because his next year as a junior, when he beat Leon Martin, there was 9 wrestlers in the weight class. So this goes back to this is pre-World War II, and we're looking at match totals. He's got 37 total, didn't have the senior year, and then he only had 9 wrestlers in his weight as a senior, whereas now we've got 33. We've had usually 20-something plus. He did have, I think 16's a quality number in that era, but it's again, you're going through that, and that's kind of a hard thing to kind of try to wrap your head around. One, war broke out, and so he was done, and he'd never lost. But how deep was the wrestling at the time? So he's one of those guys that really has kind of fallen through the cracks of wrestling lore, because I'd only recently heard about him after he'd passed away. And then we're doing the research for this list, and I see he's on the ballot. I'm like, oh. And then you start digging a little bit about, like, man, this guy could have, statistically, he's one of the all-time greats, but again, he's one of those greats that just kind of got lost in history. Maybe some of that's because he wasn't at a powerhouse program. He's an Ivy League. You look at the list, how many Ivies are on here? So, it's one of those things where this is a guy we probably should know more about and should talk more about. We just need to find out more about him.
Yeah, fortunately, we've got a platform where we're actually talking about him and giving a voice to what, the great things he accomplished in the sport. Unfortunately, that asterisk, right, with the World War II, unfortunately, we're living literally in a year where a lot of guys that we're going to be talking about historically moving forward, we're going to have to navigate what the asterisk is and what that means. And yes, DiBatista was undefeated. He was a 2-time champ, but how many previous champs have we seen lose that last tournament, lose in their senior year, lose?
Gable guy. We talked a lot about Dwayne Keller.
So we want to assume, based upon history, well, this guy is 2-time undefeated champ. He'll win again. Well, history, if we look in history, that's not necessarily the case. And in most cases, it doesn't happen like that. That's why we only have 4-time national champs, right?
Yeah, we've also, and we know wrestling is like we said, it's a very fickle bird. That thing wrestling will spit you up, chew you out, and leave. It doesn't care about your emotions and doesn't care about history. For you to beat wrestling, it's great. It's again, we bring this back to everything that happened with Cael's run to from a rolled ankle to a DQ, a slam. Those type of things, and it's a hard thing to assume that won't happen throughout the course of the season. But again, this is one of these forgotten heroes what we've got that we really need to do. And I know University of Pennsylvania and their sports info and their Roger Rain and his crew out there also, they really did a good job in the last couple of weeks since Dick passed away to really let the world know about him. So it's something that this, at least when we're doing the show, this is fresh in people's minds. So if you haven't, you're actually in your timeline searches are actually close enough to go back and find it. So if you're listening to this and you want to, like, who's this guy talking about? You can actually find some information pretty quickly because, he did pass away recently. So there's a lot of news out there about him emanating from PennAthletics.com. And so, Brandon Slay's Twitter has been talking about him. So, and the Penn RTC. So that's some stuff out there to go find some things about this guy that we really have very little on.
And hopefully for all these guys, if nothing else, JB, these 3 segments where we've discussed this 75th anniversary team, hopefully we've exposed and given a glance into window of some of these greats that we haven't talked about, that we need to continue to remember. Like, we shouldn't just get so focused on who's the next freshman national champ, who's the next 4-timer, who's going to win this year's team title. Like, the beauty of the sport, it's built on the backs of all these stories that we're talking and possibly shining a light on. So hopefully people don't take this, and we've tried not to take these episodes too seriously. It's just fun. It's fun having these conversations and just getting a better understanding of what these individuals actually did and the enormity of it. I mean, each one of their stories, like, you could probably dedicate an entire podcast to just, hey, we're going to focus on Dick DiBatista's career. We probably couldn't do it justice in an hour, but I'm glad we've at least taken 5 minutes or so to recognize him and the greatness that he served in the sport of wrestling.
Now, you talked about who's the next true freshman that's going to win it. Well, our next one's Dick Hutton. And in 1947, he was one of 5 true freshmen to win it. And he went 1-1-2-1 in the era of the only year a true freshman was eligible until we got to 1968. I think it's 68. That's the number that keeps jumping out at me in the new era. I want to say 68 because in 70, Larry Owings was a sophomore, wrestled as a true freshman 69. So, okay, I think it's 68, but 47 was that asterisk year where they had, when wrestling started back up, 46. All right, all the freshmen, you get the 1 year in 47, and that's where we got them all. And when Yanni and Spencer Lee won and becoming the first, multiple true freshmen, it had been since 1947. So when you look at this, though, beats Vern Gagne as a freshman in the semifinals 2-1. Then his sophomore year, there's a round robin at the weight class. So this is we're talking heavyweight here. Vern Gagne won it that year at 191 pounds. Then we come up to the junior year. This is where Dick Hutton loses to Vern Gagne. Yes, that Vern Gagne of the AWA professional wrestling fame by a referee's decision. Stop me if you've heard this before. And then his senior year wins 1-1 in a referee's decision. Interesting. As a freshman, he beat Ray Gunkel of Purdue in overtime. So all three of his championships were won in overtime. One loss was by, actually 3 of his titles were determined in overtime. I want to get my facts right here. Winning one, it's just the round robins are what they are. And then you've got a champ. The only year he didn't win was the champ at 191. Comes up the next year. So we've got 1-1-2-1. You lose to a champ in the finals. I mean, it's like Dick Hutton, Oklahoma A&M. This is one that's 42-1-1. I mean, the loss, it's wild. So trying to wrap my head around all those stats and realize that, it was one of the pioneers of professional wrestling, Vern Gagne, that kept this guy from being the first 4-timer and the first opportunity that could have happened. So, you you see the videos of Banach saying, trying to become the first and all this back in the 80s. Well, Dick Hutton could have been the answer, 47, 48, 49, he loses, 50, he wins. So, we could have had a 4-timer as early as 1949 with this asterisk year 47.
Which is crazy. Like, and this goes back to the DiBatista and why you can't just assume, because each one of these guys, like, if we go down through the list, how many potential, I wasn't aware there were that many potential 4-timers that were disrupted in the last 2 years of their career. It seems like the majority of guys that went on to be 3-timers, the majority of guys, it was a loss in their final 2 years, not a loss in their first 2 years that stopped them from winning 4.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, nothing's a given here. Nothing's a given except for the sun coming in my eyes. Of course, what happens, Matt? This is craziness. So you're going to get a nice, clean sheen coming in on the window because, I'm distracted now. But but the point is there, you can't just assume it. And I mean, how many losses are we've seen a 1-1-2-1. There's 2 of them on this list already. Banach was 1-1-2-1. McElravy was a 1-1-2-1. So that junior year, man, it's not the senior year. It's not the Keller Gable. It's that senior year that's doing it. Now, moving on to Jess Lewis, and I did not know much about Jess Lewis other than his name, and I'd mentioned it. We mentioned it in the show with Pendleton because he's one of the greats from Oregon State. Jess Lewis was freshman ineligible. In 1968 he was a sophomore, so he just missed that 4-year eligibility mark. As a sophomore, 23-1, losing in the finals. Never lost again. 22-0 as a junior, 31-0 as a senior. Lost to Dave Porter of Michigan in the finals as a sophomore. Beat Jeff Smith of Michigan State as a junior. Beat Greg Wojciechowski of Toledo, the great Wojo, another guy that had a tremendous career post college with he did some of that Olympic style wrestling and then did some of that professional style wrestling. Man, you want to talk about just Jess Lewis, another guy that doesn't get talked about. 2-1-1, one loss in the finals as a sophomore, and then Wojciechowski, like he lost to, I mean, there's just that was a great era of heavyweights, is what I'm basically saying, and upper weights, and it's just like Jess Lewis is a guy that just, it seems like he's forgotten.
No, I mean, this whole list is forgotten, JB, for the most part. I mean, I look at Jess Lewis, and again, this is a name that I knew, but I didn't know. I can't say that I knew much about him outside of his name, and that I knew he was an NCAA champ, but I didn't know the history of his career. But I can, actually going through this list, I can probably say that to at least half the guys. Like I'm very familiar with their names, but not really what their career entailed. And I mean, this is just insane. I mean, this list, I think we're running out of superlatives here.
Yeah,
is that what you say?
Interesting too. Yeah, I mean, one thing I found out was interesting is that losing to Dave Porter by a point. Now, Dave Porter from Michigan was a champion, was third, and was a champ in his last 3 years. Went 51-3. Oddly enough, the year Lewis wins his first one, it was Porter got upset by a guy from Adams State from the college division. And then that basically opens the door for the first title. So it's just like, what? So, and then Porter ends up beating Wojciechowski in the finals, like another year. So it's just, oh man, it's wacky. One loss, 76-1 goes 2-1-1.
Which is crazy. Yeah. The crazy thing here for me, JB, is that, as good as this committee was, that they still failed to include some of these guys on the list.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, because I can't fault the fans for not knowing, because the fans determined, they voted on the team. They selected the team, but there was a good committee of very knowledgeable people that assembled these lists. And for some of these guys not to be on it, like a Jimmy Jackson, I mean, that was mind-boggling to me. A Greg Jones is not on this, which is crazy to think about, even though his senior year was in 2005, right? So he didn't make the list at the time. But yeah, all these guys. I mean, that's the thing.
Moving on, Mark Lieberman, Lehigh, 85-6, DNP 2-1-1. Freshman year as a true freshman in 75, went 17-4. It was one of those things where he did have the opportunity to wrestle back. He did lose 2 matches there. So he had a true freshman year where he didn't place. Then he comes back, finishes second, and, wrestles Rod Kilgore from Oklahoma in the finals, then beats Dave Severn from Arizona State as a senior, also has a win over Oklahoma State's Weiss. So in 78. So 2 undefeated seasons, 85-6. And again, this might be a victim of Lehigh's small stature in terms of its alumni base. We know the proud wrestling history. We talked about it a lot at length when we talked about Daryl Burley in his spot on the ballot. But I hear a lot about Mark and Mike Lieberman. You see 6 losses, you see 2 titles, you see, not a victim of the 2 and out situation that you do at some other weights. And it's one of those things that's like, yeah, this is a tough list. And it's like, how do you remove? I mean, that's almost a matter of fact. Well, sorry, 6 losses and 2 titles. That's.
I mean, you almost have to be. you have to just almost. apply a strict criteria, like, okay, 2 or less, you're not in consideration here, because there's so many dominant people that you have to almost apply a strict criteria and remove anything from that. So, I mean, the best way for me it would be 3 or above. 3 or above, you're on the list.
Well, we still have to talk about him because we're about to eliminate half the list here too. It's like one of those things we talk about. And when I'm going to scroll back up for a second on our notes and look at this. So here's the 3-time champs again on the ballot. It was Hutton, Banach, Haselrig, McCready, and Schultz. Those are just the 3 on the there's 5 on the ballot. Then you've got the 2-timers that if you just look at, you've got Angle, Neal, Chris Campbell, DiBatista, Lewis, Lieberman, and then the 3 we're going to get to next: Ben Peterson, Greg Strobel, Chris Taylor. Those are it's just like you almost like, wow, that is just a heartless criteria to have, much like the sunlight, Matt. Now, as we move on, Earl McCready, this is the one where we made the case for Bill Cole about being undefeated, winning everything. And we look at the record of Earl McCready at 25-0 in his career, 1928, 1929, and 1930. Records of 10-0, 7-0, and 8-0. And Bill Cole was post World War II. So I think we have more of a more modern era. I wouldn't consider, the post World War II to 68, I think is that next era, but an undefeated 3-time champion. And it's like, in the 1920s and 30s, this is just, you don't want to just pass them off, but I mean, our grandparents have no history of this. So, I mean, like I think all 4 of my grandparents have passed away, and neither of them were born, or they might've been, actually, no, one was 7 when Earl McCready won his first title. So we've got people that are born, in the 1910s that we're talking about here. And I just, with the risk of sounding more stupid than I already do trying to explain this, I got nothing on Earl McCready, and I don't know if we can even, I mean, can he be considered here?
And JB, if you can't talk to this, surely I can't. So I'm just going to keep, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut on this one. And just defer to you and defer to your comments. Obviously, just like DiBatista, like, we're acknowledging his greatness, even though we don't know much about Earl McCready. And there's not much that, I mean, even if there was something to find out with 25 matches spaced over 3 years, pre-World War II, I really don't know what we could find to create more of a compelling case outside of recognizing this guy was a 3-time national champ.
And he's undefeated 3-time champ. And that was the era where that was the bar. So, I mean, he set the bar once. Now, I want to roll back to Haselrig something real quick, because one thing we talked about Utaki in the lightweights was the changing of the rule. He changed the rules. Well, a lot of people call that Division II to Division, the D2 and D3 guys into Division I, the Haselrig rule. Whether or not it is actually him that was the culprit, he was the last big-time name. Him and Dan Russell were the last big-time names to come in and make that impact, coming from Division II to Division III. So for the previous criteria that we had kind of air-checked, if you're that good that you change a rule, you probably should be considered. So that's another point for Carlton Haselrig. Scrolling down to more 2-timers. This was the one when I initially looked at us as if we were going to bump one guy off the list and replace him with somebody. I would have bumped Kurt Angle off and replaced him with Stephen Neal, just based on, he's got the 4-2-1-1. He's got better placements. He's got less losses. The monsters that he had to go through. I mean, he had a loss as a freshman too. He was upended as the number 10 seed, lost to the 7 Seth Brady from Illinois, then loses to he's the number 10 seed, comes back and wrestles in that 3rd place match, losing to Tolly Thompson. The next year, he loses to Kerry McCoy and beats Tolly Thompson. So his junior year, he basically, the weight kind of dissolved for him, and he ended up beating the number 11 seed in the finals, Tech to Trent Heineck. But that weight had Jason Gleesman, Shelton Benjamin, Derek Del Porto, Bill Clausen, and Wes Hand. And then his senior year, he beat Brock Lesnar. So I think from a quality of a competition standpoint, that I think is significantly bigger than Angle's, just based on simple credentials of your opponents. And then, he wasn't yet spoiled by the NFL hype in that era. So, I mean, he was still, I think he still wrestled at the trial. Yeah, he still wrestled the trials in 2004. So he wasn't even in camp, or he had gotten maybe a tryout or two at this point in 2005 when this team comes out. But he doesn't make the team in 2004. And I think if we revote on this list, and, Stephen Neal's got a couple Super Bowl rings and he's a distinguished member, I think he conceivably, in a fan vote, could replace Kurt Angle if we don't get the professional wrestling fans voting and get the New England Patriot fans voting. That's, who knows that, but the angle 4-2-1-1, Cal State Bakersfield, knowing with the budget that they had and how good they were with what limited resources they had, they had just made the move from Division II to Division I, and then this monstrosity that's named Stephen Neal, yikes. I mean, I'm a big guy, but I could fit in one of the sleeves of his like jean jacket or his leather jacket. I worked at an event with him once. I'm like, you're huge.
And I had the opportunity to interview Steven about a year ago, and he's more fascinating in person than even watching in competition. I mean, just highly intelligent, highly engaging, like just one of the most fascinating guys I've ever had the opportunity to spend a couple hours with. But when I think of Stephen Neal, 6'5", 270 plus, that wrestled like a lightweight. We talk about JB's double and having one of the greatest doubles of all time. People just need to go back and revisit Stephen Neal's career and watch his double leg and how explosive. It wasn't just it just wasn't this massive person that was bowling ball, wrecking a person and knocking them over. Like, he was quick, explosive. There was a level change like a lightweight. There was an explosiveness exploding off his knee to his opponents, just literally knocking them off their feet.
He might have broken more ribs than Famous Dave's. It was like, seriously, go find, took you a second on that one. You had to go find a clip on YouTube of him wrestling this poor bastard from South Africa. Match went about 13 seconds. Double legged him off the mat, cracked his. That was it. That was it. I don't even think they scored it. They might have, but it was one of those things that, like, here's the match, and Stephen Neal, and you draw South Africa. Thanks for coming out. And I think the match went 13 seconds, and it was an injury default because he had basically pulverized this man's intestines and ribs and took his soul while he was at it. So it was one of the more, I mean, if it's not in a horror movie, it's in that South African's horror movie. I can tell you that, because wow. He did that to Shumlin too, from Russia a couple times. And, the battles that they had, the world championships. It was like, how does anybody survive this thing?
And Stephen Neal was the precursor to the modern era of heavyweights that we're seeing post what I would say from 2010 through 2020. We've been spoiled and by all these great athletic, active heavyweights, the Snyders, the Gwizzes, all these great heavyweights that have come through that we've been fortunate enough to see in the last decade. Well, Stephen Neal was the precursor of that. Like, before, I think you either had these small athletic, David type heavyweights in Kurt Angle, or you had the big behemoths that would just physically overwhelm you with their size. He was the combination of both those people. He combined the big behemoth body of a 6'5", 280 plus heavyweight with the athleticism of, a Kurt Angle-ish 220 type heavyweight. And this is the first time that we've in my mind, that when I had been around wrestling, that I got to witness firsthand, what a heavyweight could be and should be and what we aspire it to be. He is, to this day, still in my mind, the prototypical. If I could build up a heavyweight body frame, Stephen Neal would be the prototypical heavyweight that I would build up if I had to build one.
Yeah, he's one of my favorites of all time too. And again, we've got a two-timer here, and I'm going to still fight he might be my asterisk, but no, that's the two-timer that might have to go on this list. Ben Peterson did not wrestle, 4-1-1, 74-4. Again, Ben and his brother John really got a lot of their lore coming from 72 in Munich and 76 in Montreal as their Olympians. Of course, his brother John never was a high placer at the NAIA when he was wrestling, and then Ben wrestled with Gable and those guys at Iowa State. Also want to mention the fact that John Peterson never won a state title, neither did Stephen Neal. So that's one interesting fact there. And again, I hate to glaze over an Iowa State guy because Ben Peterson's one of the most salt of the earth human beings you're ever going to find. But, just had the one match as a freshman, then 4 losses as a sophomore, 27-0 junior, 25-0 as a senior in 72, and then was on that 72 Olympic team, which kind of was the new bar for our Olympic performance in terms of guys. We talked about Gable and Sanders and Taylor, which we'll talk to in a minute, and just the Petersons, and there's so many great wrestlers on that team. So, again, I don't know enough about Ben Peterson's career. I'm looking at some of the names that he had defeated on the way to those placements, and not a lot of them jump out at me on the page. So, we can't really knock him for the field. But again, I'm going to profess my ignorance on Ben Peterson in terms of his career, knowing that I think what he does with his current role in life, I think he has no problem of us overlooking his wrestling career and giving him more credit for what he's doing now than he did as a college athlete.
Yeah, for sure. And I think he would probably be the first to say, like, his collegiate career is magnified by his international career. He and his brother both established their names, as you said, through their runs through 72 and 76. They became names for their international careers. And then as a byproduct, Ben's collegiate career was elevated because it was a byproduct because he was with Gable, and Gable he raised all tides.
You're a two-time champ. You got 4 career losses. That's pretty darn good. I mean, Tim Krieger, we were just talking about him in the last episode. He is a 2-time champ that has 3 losses. It's like, all right, well, you're not good enough to make this list. That's just crazy just to think about, man. I mean,
and there's one other Iowa State guy that's was undefeated his last 2 years that we haven't even brought up. One of the mythical body figures, right?
We'll get to him in a second, as we just mentioned him on the 72 team. And I hate to just jump over Ben, but we have to also get and spend some significant time looking at Mark Schultz, who, again, he was 97 and 18, is a 3-time champ. D&P as a freshman at UCLA in 1979. Dave was going to come with him. Then they dropped the program. Then they both end up at Oklahoma because Dave was at Oklahoma State first and then transferred to Oklahoma. Well, 80, 80 marks out. Then he comes back and beats Mike Deanna, beats Ed Banach, beats Dwayne Goldman. This is another guy that beat 3 Hawkeyes in the finals, which I also found was interesting. We mentioned that about Mark Chiarella. And look at the placements of the last 3 years. This is what makes Mark Schultz, I think, his college career. What hurts that freshman year, 19 and 10, lost to Carter Mario of North Carolina and did not place. That DNP, and then you've got a 1-1-1. Mike Deanna, who he beat as a sophomore, placed 3rd, 6th, 2nd, and 2nd. Ed Banach, who he beat as a junior, placed 1st, 2nd, 1st. Dwayne Goldman, who he beat as a senior, placed 2nd, 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 1st. Has anybody ever won 3 titles and beat that many quality? He beat 3 4-time All-Americans in the finals. That to me is the most. I mean, we can talk about Mark Schultz breaking people's arms and their faces in the UFC and in the Olympics, but to look at that, beating a 4-time All-American Mike Deanna is impressive. Then to beat Banach and Dwayne. There's two of those guys were 4-time finalists. Matt, he beat 2 of them. And that's a really, the DNP, the 18 losses, that's one of those things where you have to look at it and be like, well, chalk it up to UCLA not giving a crap, because I don't know if there is a more impressive, and thing is, Schultz only had 1 undefeated season. So that's also what's crazy impressive. You can't just say these are the best 3 seasons anybody ever had. I can tell you what, it might be the best 3 finals matches any 3-time champ ever had in terms of credentials, because it's just mind-boggling that the number of just beasts that he beat in the final. I mean, that's just wrap your head around that for a second.
Yeah. So, I look at that and I don't know what's more impressive, that the guys he beat or the guys that beat him. I'm like, so what happened? What was going on? That would be a fascinating question that I would like to talk to Mark Schultz about is, did he take the Allen Iverson approach to the regular season? Is like, we talk about practice?
Practice, dude. You remember, I grew up 5 minutes from Bubba Chuck.
Yeah.
So you talk Allen Iverson. That is in my.
Which I figured you would impress.
That's in my Bubba Chuck. Allen Iverson's right? In my wheelhouse. That's for sure. That's.
But really, that's my thing. Like, when it was on the line, based upon who he beat, would he be the guy? If you had to pick one choice to wrestle in the NCAA finals, that might be my choice when all is on the line. But he would probably be my last choice of all the greats on these lists. When the match is on the line in the regular season, would you want this guy? Well, based upon his record, I would say Probably not.
Well,
but
he
when
did 10
everything
losses
matters,
as a freshman, so he had, it's like one of those things. It's like, how do we do that? So, maybe the math is wrong. Maybe I read that wrong. Give me a second because my math doesn't quite work. So hold that thought as I go back to the late Jay Hammond's site. And the one thing about WrestlingStats.com is it has a situation where you can find a champ, and then you can search the champ, and you can pull up 15 losses. Okay, so he's 97-15, so he's not quite. I gotta correct that, or else he might see this and come after me. I don't know because I also called his Twitter a kind of train wreck about half hour ago. So I might be setting myself up for disaster.
So it kind of looks like there's a big difference. Obviously, what was going on at UCLA, not that you can remove it because it was wrestled there, but
Mark also only wrestled 2 years in high school too. I mean, he was still learning how to wrestle. I mean, I'm guessing that, UCLA was a good option for him. I mean, I'm sure he's written and talked about this, but it seems like that switch flipped. Obviously, the year off in 80, but I mean, you've got one of the most. Now it comes to a situation where you want to beat somebody handily, and you pick in the finals you pick a Cael Sanderson. You want to beat somebody up and win the title, then you pick a Mark Schultz. My goodness, that's one of the most crazy things to me. And we could talk. We have a whole episode on Schultz, and there's still two of the ballots that we got. Greg Strobel was DNP 5-1-1, 124 5-1. I got to really know Greg when he was coaching at Lehigh, and his late wife Donna was such a doll to be around. She was so fun, and Mrs. Coach was just cool, and that was one of the hard things to swallow in the last couple months. But when we talk about Greg's career, he lost in a situation where he didn't get pulled back in as a freshman in overtime. He got pinned in overtime by the number 2 seed. So you are that close, and then that guy Paul Zander from Iowa gets upset. Greg's out. Then, as a sophomore, Greg Strobel loses in the Conci semis to Zander, loses in the semis to Ben Peterson pretty handily, beats a guy named Fletcher Carr twice, and we mentioned the Carr family on the last episode. Yes, that Carr, he was at the University of Tampa at the time, wins over Johnny Johnson of Northern Illinois and Ben Ojai of BYU in the finals. So while the credentials of the guys he beat in the finals were not impressive, Greg Strobel was an OW. He was a dynamic figure, and I learned more about Greg for the first time in that Veritas documentary that was on John Trench about, at this point, 10, 12, 15 years ago. I don't know how many years ago it was, but again, Greg's a guy that I would love to talk about for hours at a time, but a DNP 5-1-1 really kind of hurts, and I think maybe he was put on the list from a situation because Lehigh was rolling at this time in 05, so they were having some really good seasons, so maybe it was his coaching recency that was helping him. But again, he's got a great career, 2-time champ. I mean, but again, DNP 5-1-1 probably hurts in the scale of this general discussion.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, talk about a great career in wrestling. He's one of the when I think about Greg, right now we're talking about the competitor, but talking about a coach and him being a national team coach, him being president of USA Wrestling, his being president of the NWCA. I mean, his body of work in the sport, he's one of the all-time greats in the sport of wrestling. But, the DNP 5 probably eliminates him from this list, but it doesn't. Don't
you feel so heartless, Matt? Don't you, when we talk about this, don't you sometimes feel heartless about like these guys are so much better than us, and we have to fight? Well, that DNP and that 5, it's like my dad with the report card in the second grade. I came home all A's and 1 B. What about that B? Well, that's keeping me from getting a Nintendo. Thank you very much. But yeah, it's one of those like, come on. Oh, and I would love. Like I said, we should get Greg on the show because he's got some stories to tell. That would be interesting. Now, as we move on to the next one, this individual was a literal giant. Chris Taylor only wrestled 2 years in Division I, or actually it was right around Division I, starting that 1973. So he's at NCAA level, but he was a 2-year All-American at the junior college level, was first and third at the junior college level at Muskegon in Michigan, and then ends up winning 2 NCAA championships, 37-0-1 as a junior, 43-0 as a senior. Actually was an Olympic medalist and then came back to wrestle his senior year in 1973. And that is Chris Taylor. Had a professional wrestling career. Lost him, I believe he was 29, 30 years old when he passed. I think late 1979, I want to say, off the top of my head. But we're looking at a guy that had 2 of the most impressive seasons at heavyweight. And if there's any who had a better only 2-year career than Chris Taylor, and he definitely deserved to be on this list. And what's interesting is he was third. Who beat him in 1970 at the junior college championships? But I mentioned this on the phone. His first championship at the NJCAA in 1969 was against Harry Garris, who was eventually an All-American at Oklahoma State and an Olympian for Canada. So in the 1969 NJCAA national finals, you had 2 Olympians facing off against one another at then unlimited. Harry Garris of Canada for Joliet Junior College and Chris Taylor from Muskegon Community College. That's just I love those type of things.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I think about Chris Taylor, I think maybe the unfortunate thing is we've turned this guy into a caricature when he was actually a really, really, really good wrestler. 2-time NCAA champ, Olympic medalist, but in some ways in my mind, Chris Taylor has always been a caricature. And maybe it's because, I grew up seeing him getting posterized by the West German on the poster. I mean, that was one of the classic, if there was a run of 5 posters in the wrestling world, that was one of the top 5 of him getting belly to belly supplayed by the West German.
Yeah, Wilfred Dietrich, who actually, what's interesting about that story is Dietrich wrestled in 5 Olympic games. He had wrestled in both styles. If I can remember the stat correctly, competed at the Olympics in competitions 5 times. That's the one he didn't medal in. He won that match, but he didn't medal because his entire spine was essentially pulverized by that move. He didn't place that year. Taylor got pretty sure Taylor got the bronze in that style. Wilfred Dietrich had I think 5 Olympic medals, and that was, or he was going to maybe that would have been his 6th if he'd have placed, and he didn't. I can verify that quickly, but again, I think if you try to find a YouTube video of that, it's just like you can almost hear yourself going timber when Dietrich locks it up. And as the story goes, Matt, Dietrich had seen him and hugged him just to see if he could get his hands around. And I don't know what would possess anybody to want to throw a redwood over their head. It just baffles me that just the mind of a competitor sometimes. He's a
wrestler. He's a wrestler. He did it to see if he could do it, right? I think at that point, for a guy that's wrestled in, literally over 20 years of Olympics, like
Matt, when we had guys in college that tell you, "Oh, you won't do it," and that's usually a dare. You won't. Yeah, it's like, hey, throw Chris Taylor. You won't do it. That's exactly what happened. I mean, I'm just having nightmares back thinking about that. Hold on. I got my I got my international search databases. Where's my Olympic medalist? All right, let me pull this up real quick because Dietrich Wilfred might help if I spell his name right. Dietrich. There we go. Let's copy that. You're getting some live bad podcasting here, Matt. Actually, he did place. Yeah, placed 5 times. Was in 56, 60, 64, 68. So yeah, 51, 2, 3, 4. This was his 5th games, and he placed in the previous. He did not place in 72, and he threw the biggest man on the planet and didn't get any medals for it. So it was a Greco silver in 56, freestyle gold in 60, Greco silver also in 60. So he was a gold medalist and a silver medalist the same year in 1960. 1964 took a bronze in Greco. 1968 took a bronze freestyle in Mexico City. So the story of that guy is also maybe another one of those. He's like a mythical
one
creature.
Of the best.
And he did in 72. In 72, he throws Chris Taylor, wins the match, and doesn't place because he's been wheeled out of there and put back together. We now know him as the $6 million man.
And I guess the fascinating story there is like, just based upon those stats, like, has there been, I'm sure there has been someone, but how many wrestlers have won multiple freestyle
It's a
and
very
multiple
short
Greco?
list. It's a
Yeah.
very short list. I know the late Danielle Robben did it. I want to say in '68, off the top of my head. He was I think he was silver in both styles. You have to go back to like the 30s, and you're usually looking at the Swedes or the Estonians or the Finns, even though they don't have much of a freestyle program now. But it was those are the type of countries that were more likely to have wrestled in both styles, and it's very rare. I know that Robben was from France, and France has a pretty decent Greco culture. So those are questions that with about 15 minutes of a heads up I probably could have had for you, but I didn't expect us to talk Greco-Roman on a show where we're talking about college wrestling. But and that leaves us with the two names that were not on the ballot that we were talking about. Greg Jones, who went one, then famously DNP, and then won, lost 4 matches his entire career, 2 of which were one day. Those losses to Ralph Everett and Rashad Evans. Everett, I remember because he was in the conference at the time and it was on a tiebreaker. Didn't get taken down in either match. You don't get taken down, you lose 2 matches, and that's that is your sophomore year. It was like, what? Because that was in Kansas City. It was wackadoodles, I can tell you that.
I mean, it wasn't a bad day. It was a bad session, wasn't it? Wasn't he done in the first session?
Might have come back when. By the way, and the thing is, can we even talk Greg Jones here? Honestly, because if he's graduating in 05, he's on the mats when this. So he's probably disqualified from this discussion for the 75th team because we might be wasting our airtime on this.
I think we're actually wasting our time. He was wrestling his last year of eligibility was when they were unveiling the team at the tournament.
Yeah. So
I think he's probably in the follow-up discussion.
We'll have to table him for the 90th. But then we mentioned Jimmy Jackson. So 88, 9-2, does not place as a freshman and goes 1-1-1. So we've got another giant heavyweight, and this is another Michigander, go figure. It's just the lore, the name Jimmy Jackson's like, oh, he's people know him. He actually still has a pretty good, name. Oh yeah, Jimmy Jackson, 3-time champ Oklahoma State. He's not a forgotten name. He's just one, I think, in an era of great big men. And then now that unlimited has gone away, he's in that Giants era, the Tab Thackers, the Chris Taylors, the Jimmy Jacksons. Even though he wasn't quite as large as Tab and Chris Taylor, he still had a significant amount of size to him. So again, you got a 3-time champ and a disqualifying fact. He wasn't even on the ballot, Matt. It's like me getting mad at Gray Simons being on, but somebody from Michigan is a big time Jimmy Jackson guy. Like, he wasn't even on the ballot. He should have been on the team. I mean, it's a hard sell when you've got, and you got to put him behind Mark Schultz in terms of DNP 1-1-1s in terms of the pecking order here. So I don't know if we've solved anything. I just know that it's going to be really hard to figure out who that 5th guy is, because I don't know. You got Sanderson, you got Hodge, you got Banach, you got Haselrig, and we're now got a 3-time champ like Jimmy Jackson wasn't even on the ballot. I almost don't want to stop this series. I want to keep going, Matt.
No, I mean, where do you? I mean, we could have probably honestly, JB, broken up just the upper weights into three episodes in and of themselves. I mean, if we really wanted to yeah, I don't know.
Angle's off. Like, it's the thing. It's like easy one's Angle, you're out. And then now you're like, well, who do we replace? Because I was coming in, my mindset was to replace him with Kurt Angle. Replace Kurt Angle with Stephen Neal. And now I don't know who the hell to replace him with. I'm looking at the 2-time champs. The only one I can really make a case for is probably Stephen Neal. But then I look at the 3-time champs. I'm like, well, Mark Schultz's freshman year. It's like, well, we have a Haselrig there with a D&Q as a freshman. Mark Schultz is just looking at the amount, just the bodies that he beat to win those titles. To me, I think, and this, I don't think this is actually recency bias with all the Foxcatcher stuff. Honestly, I'm like, Mark Schultz might have to be my guy at that number 5. That 5th guy. It's crazy. Even with the DNP as a freshman.
Yeah, because when you think about, okay, there's something to say you beat someone from the same school 3 years in a row, but it's an entirely different discussion of saying I beat an all-time great from a school in an era where they were reeling off. This is when Iowa's on the rise. They were reeling off national titles consecutively, and to beat a guy from Iowa, the premier program, the bully, the bully on the block, to do it 3 straight years. And imagine the motivation of those Hawkeyes.
He beat 3 4-time All-Americans. He beat 2 4-time finalists. And again, I'm a stats guy. If you can put these numbers on together, you'd be like, whoever's got the 1-1-2-1 wins, or a 1-1. Like, if you put all those points together, you get no points for DNP. But I just, as I've done the research on this, and I'm looking at the people that Mark Schultz beat. I mean, Ed Banach, Dwayne Goldman was in the finals 4 years in a row. I mean, so with Banach, it stopped Banach from being a 4-timer. It was just like, and then as I learned about Jess Lewis, I'm like, that guy. So, I mean, Kurt Angle has been dropped down this list significantly because I think he's behind Stephen Neal. I think he's behind Jess Lewis, just at the weight class. Chris Taylor makes a strong case, although I think that third in the junior college might be the most disqualifying factor. And then, it's been fun, but I think Mark, again, against he's got the most losses out here. He also didn't place, but yet I'm going to put him on the list just because of those. I would put him on my list because of the 3 guys he beat have a combined 12 placements at the championships. That's just holy crap.
So I guess if I had to
2 of them won championships.
Yeah. I think if you create some more criteria, like I go with titles, but also if I really had to go with my gut, March only matters. Like, I say it as a coach. I said it to my teams all the time. It's like, guys, this is all preparation. Now, it doesn't remove the ledger on your wins and loss record historically, but
that freshman year at UCLA, that counts. That's something to consider. But I'm just like, there's definitely, I don't know.
He was undefeated. He was undefeated. We said he only had 1 undefeated season, but he was undefeated at the NCAA tournament 3 straight years.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things to argue. I mean, when we go this, and we're going to start talking about Jake Rosholt on our next breakdown when we get to the 90-year team. And you want to talk about the guy's got 20 losses, and he's a 3-time NCAA champion and a 4-time All-American. So we're going to get into these discussions again, Matt. And I don't know what you ultimately picked as your 5th guy. We'll probably reset, and maybe you squirmed out of this without making the hard decision, but I can tell you what, this has been so fun to put together. And those of you out there watching that are just been kind of, you're learning along with us. It's been a real fun project. And it was one of those things that I initially had this in mind when I pitched it to Matt, like, I'm going to get Gray Simons on this team. And then it all of a sudden turns into something that we've had, over 3 hours of great conversation with, and when we can talk about the people that weren't even on the ballot even more, if we did that, the Lowell Langs on here, guys like Greg Johnson, Larry Haynes, Keith Young, Lowell Lang, Jack Van Beber. These are names that we were researching that they weren't even on the ballot. And it's crazy to know. I mean, we could do a whole episode on the best 3-timers you've never heard of, and that are from like the modern era, or the people now that are going through. It's like, oh, my dad's mentioned them, or the old timers know that they've heard of them. They came up seeing them, but it's just, I've loved this project so much, and it really kind of has opened my eyes a little bit. I'm digging through some of the old the programs from 29 and 30 and 31, and then my AWNs from 56 on, trying to come up with some more stuff that we can talk about, and just, be able to educate myself and be better at my job and do better at our show here. And I think everybody that's given us the high fives on this, because it's been really cool to do.
It's been super, super fun. And I'm actually looking forward to the 90th team. And I think there's going to be a lot of people that are like, they think they know who would be on the all-time great teams based on the last 15, but do they really? And that's going to be the fascinating thing. Is it revisionist history that we are like just so much caught up in the moment, and there's so much information at our disposal and so many matches that all these guys have been great over the last 15 years, but how do they stand up to the all-time greats? And that's going to be another fun discussion.
Now, one thing we might need to consider too is you can't really keep a list the same size. You're going to have to expand it, because you got 75. You kept 15 spots for 75 years. Now there's 15 more years, which is a fifth, if my math is right. You're adding a fifth more years to that. So you probably need to add, maybe one more spot. Maybe we only add one per weight class, and we argue for that sixth. Who do we bump out? So maybe that's what we do, is we add every 15 years, we add another one. So we get to that. But for this discussion, it's been fun. We'll work on the semantics of the 90th team when we get to there and have that hypothetical debate. But that's where we stand on episode 146, Matt. 145, 146. I think we're at 146. Yep. Whatever we started at, 146 of the RUDIS Wrestling Podcast. Thanks for listening. It's been fun. We'll see you next time.